In this lesson, we'll use the 3ds Max skylight to incorporate some secondary illumination into our scene. Alright, so if we render out what we have currently, you can see that we do have some initial lighting in our scene from the main light that we have set up, but really we still see that this is pretty dark. So what we can start to do is begin incorporating a little bit more realistic secondary illumination into this scene and start to capture a little bit more of the look of this environment and things like that. So whenever trying to create this type of lighting, a good light to use would be something like the 3ds Max skylight. So let's go to the Create menu, over into Lights. We choose this standard light menu, and let's now choose the skylight. So all we have to do is now drop this somewhere in our scene. So from the top view, I'll just simply click once to drop in the skylight, and I'll right-click to end my creation mode. So here's our skylight, this little dome that's been created. So with this selected, let's go over into the Modify menu. And what we can do is actually choose things like a light intensity, and we can actually choose some kind of a sky color. Now, instead of just the sky color, let's instead plug in a map. And the map that we'll use can be this environment. So let's just take a look at what we have currently. So if I were to render this out, just pressing Shift Q on my keyboard, you can see that the overall lighting of this scene doesn't really seem to have changed much at all. And that's because whenever rendering with Mental Ray, which is what we're doing now, this skylight really won't have any kind of an effect until we start to enable a feature called Final Gather. So Final Gather, just very simply, is a method that will allow us to basically start to sample points from any kind of surrounding environment and use that to shade our 3D geometry. So let's just take the Final Gather option, and we'll bring this up to something like low or medium. Alright, and with that adjustment, let's now re-render. Alright, and now, once this render completes, you can see that the lighting is definitely a little bit brighter compared to what we had before. But at the moment, it really doesn't seem to match up with the surrounding environment very well. And the reason for that is that right now we're just using this flat white color to light this environment with the skylight. So let's instead plug in some kind of a map. So I'm going to press the M key on my keyboard to open up my material editor. Alright, and we do still have our shading networks that were pulled up from some of our earlier lessons whenever we were connecting in the environment. So what I'm going to do is take this spherical bitmap that we had set up in one of our previous lessons and use that pretty much as the lighting source for this skylight. So I'll just move this over. Let's take the output for this bitmap. Just drag that connection over onto this map button. We'll go ahead and make sure that's connected as an instance. Alright, very nice. Now let's go ahead and re-render this. And now once this render completes, we can see that the environment matches up a little bit better compared to what we had before. So now this skylight is actually looking at the color of this environment and actually starting to now cast things like blue light down from the top and starting to get a little bit more of this kind of yellowish kind of secondary light from the sides and from the bottom as well. So looking at this though, this is still probably a little bit weak as far as the overall lighting. So let's just simply take this multiplier, and if we want this secondary illumination to be a little bit stronger, just take this and start to increase our multiplier. So let's re-render that. There we go, that's a little bit better. Now what we can also do if we want to brighten this up a little bit and add a little bit more realism is to take our Final Gather bounces and actually add another bounce to this. So that way, once the initial light from this Final Gather is calculated, again, remember that this is looking at illumination and colors from our surrounding objects and surrounding environment. Once that initial calculation happens, we can actually start to incorporate a secondary bounce that will, again, start to create a little bit more realistic illumination. So I'm going to go ahead and increase my Final Gather bounces to 1. And if we want, we could go ahead and clone this for comparison so we can have something to compare this to. So let's come back in here and re-render. Right, and once this finishes up, you can see it really, in my case, is a pretty subtle difference, not just a tremendous amount of change compared to what we had before. So you may find that sometimes this does help to add a little bit extra realism to your renders. Other times you may not necessarily need that. So in my case, since that is really not making much of an impact on my scene, I'll go ahead and just take this Final Gather bounces and bring this down to 0. Since it's really not having much of an impact, there's really no need to increase our render time by turning this feature on. at least not in this particular scene. Alright, now when we enable this Final Gather feature, it does start to add a little bit of render time to our actual renders. And this is kind of what I like to refer to as the golden rule of rendering, and that is pretty much that anything that is going to make your renders look better is also going to take more time to render. And unfortunately, that's almost an inescapable fact when it comes to rendering. Now, there are a few things that we can start to do to help speed this along. For example, if we were to take our camera view and start to expand this, again, just pressing Alt-W on my keyboard. If we were to come back to our display, if you recall from one of our previous lessons, we had turned off our particles, just so that way we didn't actually have to worry about viewing these in the scene. Now, Final Gather, with something like these particles, is really going to start to stack up on our render time. So what we can try to do is tell Final Gather to begin ignoring the calculation on these particles, and at least help our renders move along a little bit faster. So what I'll do is select my different particles here, my super sprays. Again, if I press F4 on my keyboard, I can make it a little bit easier to make sure that I do have those selected. So let's come in here and try to grab these two. Here we go. I'll just control click to make sure I have those both selected. And with those selected, let's right click and go to Object Properties. Right, and we can try to help speed this along a little bit more. We can try to disable things like the receiving of shadows, so that way we don't have to calculate shadows quite so intensely on these objects. Since they're pretty thin and we're trying to simulate kind of a thin little wisp of smoke here, not something that's not necessarily real thick and billowy, we should be able to get away with that without much problem. What I also want to do is go over into the Mental Ray tab. And if we take a look in the Final Gather, we can actually tell the Final Gather rays to just pass right through these two objects. So that way, as far as the Final Gather is concerned, these objects shouldn't even be there. And that should start to help save a little bit of render time. So let's go ahead and press OK. Let's scrub through our timeline a little bit. And let's re-render this. Again, pressing Shift-Q on my keyboard. Alright, and once this render completes, we'll see that now, because we've introduced these particles back into our render, that now these renders will take significantly longer to complete, just because now there is a lot of additional calculation that has to happen. But because we've now disabled the Final Gather calculation and minimized the amount of calculation that has to happen on these particles, we've at least minimized the impact of that render time. But again, just because we do have a lot more complexity in this scene now, that our renders will take quite a bit longer to complete. So now that we have this set up, we're pretty much finished with most of the lighting things that need to happen for this particular scene. So what we'll start to do in our next lesson is learn how we can start to render out this final sequence.